Thursday, 8:23 in the evening. A sidewalk noodle shop on Lexington Avenue, Asheville, North Carolina. The kind of place that doesn't advertise. The kind of place you find when you've lived somewhere long enough to stop looking. Cole sat alone, bowl more than half full, water untouched. He had ordered out of habit rather than hunger, the way a man does when the alternative is going home to a quiet house too early. He had just pushed the bowl to the side of the table and was staring at nothing in particular when a shadow stopped at the edge of the light. A young woman, mid-20s, maybe younger, oversized jacket, hair loose and tangled at the collar. The strap of her backpack was held together with a strip of tape. She was standing close enough to the table that the light caught her face, and what it showed wasn't desperation. It wasn't the collapsed expression of someone past caring. Her eyes were doing something different, calculating, measuring the distance between asking and the consequences of asking. She said 4 words. "Can I eat that?" She nodded at the bowl Cole had pushed aside. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. He pushed it forward without a word. She sat across from him without asking permission, without explaining herself, without thanking him yet. She just pulled out the chair and sat down the way you sit down when you have learned that grace and hesitation are luxuries you cannot always afford. Cole watched without watching. He had gotten good at that. He signaled Lena, the woman who ran the place, 60 years old, with the measured patience of someone who had watched this city change around her 3 times. And when Lena appeared, he didn't explain anything. He said, "1 more bowl, hot, and a coffee." He walked back in himself, came back out with a full bowl, a new one, steam still rising from it, and set it in front of the young woman like it was the only reasonable thing to do. Lena watched through the pass-through window. She didn't come out. She understood when something was none of her business. The young woman ate the way people eat when they are genuinely hungry, but have not forgotten how to have dignity. She didn't rush in a way that would embarrass her. She didn't slow down to perform gratitude. She ate steadily, like someone who had decided long ago that food, when it came, should be treated with respect. Cole sat across from her and let the silence be what it was. He had spent years in rooms with long tables and prepared remarks, rooms where men in careful suits spoke about poverty as a column in a spreadsheet, as a variable in a model, as a percentage point trending in the wrong direction. He had learned to read the reality those numbers pointed toward in the margins of those conversations, in the way a person held their fork, in the angle of their shoulders, in where they positioned their chair. She had placed herself closest to the door. He waited until the bowl was almost empty. Then he asked her name. She said, "Delia." He didn't follow it with a second question. Didn't ask where she'd come from. Didn't ask what had happened. Didn't ask if there was someone he could call. He let the name land, and then he stayed quiet, and she looked at him across the table with an L expression that was trying to work out what kind of person doesn't immediately follow up a name with a list of questions. She asked first, "What do you do?" Not small talk, an assessment. The tone was precise. "Plumbing," he said. She looked at his hands, the calluses along the base of his palm, the grease that had settled into the creases below his knuckles in a way that no longer fully washed out. She looked back up at him and nodded once. The answer matched the evidence. He went back inside, came out with a wrapped sandwich and a cardboard coffee cup, set them beside her without comment. She looked at the coffee for a moment longer than she looked at the sandwich. Most people, if they gave anything, gave food. Coffee meant something different. Coffee meant someone had thought about the temperature outside, not just the empty stomach. The cold. "It's cold out," Cole said. That was his entire explanation. She stood up when she was done, adjusted the one working strap of her backpack, turned toward the street. The thank you came when she was already facing away from him, not because she was ungrateful, but because she needed the distance between them before the words could come out. He heard it. He didn't respond. He let it sit. Across the street, a woman named Marin Soul had seen everything. She was 38 years old and worked as a district supervisor for the Buncombe County Department of Social Services. She had arrived at this corner by accident, cutting through on her way home after a meeting that ran long. She had taken out her phone once, a reflexive gesture, professional habit, young woman, clearly without stable housing, a situation worth documenting. But then she had watched the man at the table, the way he had moved, the way he hadn't performed any of it. He hadn't looked around to see who was watching. He hadn't explained himself to Lena, or to the girl, or to the empty street. He had simply pulled out a chair, ordered a bowl of soup, and let another person eat in peace. Marin put her phone back in her coat pocket. She walked on, but slower than before. She was at her desk by 7:15 the next morning. There was no procedure that required her to act on what she had seen. Delea, if that was a legal name on file somewhere, was an adult. Adults experiencing homelessness fell outside the mandatory intervention protocols. Marin knew this. She also knew she hadn't slept. There had been a case in Charlotte 3 years ago. A child, not an adult, a child who hadn't existed in any system until 3 weeks after someone had first noticed and done nothing. Marin had been the supervising caseworker on that case. The child was fine. Eventually, Marin had never fully forgiven herself for the 3 weeks. She drove back to Lexington Avenue before the morning rush. Lena was restocking the condiment station when Marin walked up and showed her badge. Asked about the man from the night before, Lena was careful. She answered the way people answer when they schlare. Learned that authorities asking questions don't always lead to outcomes worth celebrating. But she answered. Cole Hadley, she said. He eats here most Thursday evenings. She paused, then added something Marin hadn't asked for. He's a good man. Cole was 3 blocks away, crouched under a kitchen sink in a ground-floor apartment, when Marin knocked. He came to the door with grease on both hands, and looked at her badge, and then at her face. His expression wasn't surprised. He said, I figured someone might come by. They stood on the sidewalk. He told her what had happened, without elaboration. She asked if he knew where Delea was now. No, he said. I didn't ask. I didn't want her to feel like coming back was a risk. Marin went still for a moment. That was the correct read on the situation. It was also an instinct that took experienced caseworkers years to develop. Back at her desk, she typed his name into the state database. Cole Hadley, self-employed plumber, Asheville, North Carolina. No criminal record. Nothing. She stared at the result, and then, she wasn't entirely sure why, she typed his name again into a broader search, and added 2 words, Treasury Department. The photograph that came back was from a 2018 congressional testimony archive. A man in a gray suit, hair neat, seated behind a microphone placard bearing his full name and title, Senior Policy Economist. The author of the Federal Urban Poverty Framework, a document cited in more state-level budget hearings than any similar policy paper produced in the previous decade. The man who had written the actual structural blueprint for programs like the one Marin had been trying to build for the past 8 months. He had resigned in 2021. No statement, no press release, no interview. He had simply stopped existing in the record, the way people stop existing when they choose to. Marin set her phone face down on the desk. She stared at the parking garage across the street. She didn't understand why a person would walk away from that kind of work and end up fixing pipes in western North Carolina, but she understood something else. Last night, she had stood on that sidewalk and hesitated. She had taken her phone out and put it back and kept walking. And he, without a badge, without a protocol, without any obligation at all, had pulled out a chair. Delea came back the following Thursday. Same corner, same time. Cole had arrived 15 minutes early and ordered a second bowl before she appeared. Lena set it on the table without being asked. She had started doing that. There was no conversation about it. It was simply a fact now, the way certain things become facts without anyone deciding. This time Jasper was with him, Cole's son, 9 years old, with the solemn expression of a child who takes the things he cares about seriously. When Delea came around the corner and stopped at the sight of a boy occupying her usual chair, Jasper slid sideways to make room and nodded at her the way adults nod when they mean it. "What's your name?" he asked. Direct. Not hello, not hi, just the question, because he wanted the actual answer. She told him. "I already marked this spot," Jasper said. He produced a composition notebook from under the table and opened it to a page dense with hand-drawn lines and small labeled symbols. It was a map, or something that functioned as a map within a system of notation entirely his own. He explained each symbol with the gravity of someone presenting a formal document. Delea listened. Somewhere in the middle of the explanation, without planning to, she smiled. Small, quick, nearly nothing, but real. The second Thursday, Marin showed up. She took a table across the restaurant, ordered coffee, opened her laptop. She had told herself she was there professionally, a follow-up observation, informal, nothing requiring documentation. Cole noticed her within 30 seconds of her sitting down. He didn't acknowledge her directly. He shifted his chair by a few inches, just enough to give her a cleaner sightline to their table. The gesture had one possible meaning. I see you. It's fine. The third Thursday, she came to their table instead. She introduced herself to Delia by first name only. Delia measured her the way she measured everything, carefully, without expression. What do you do? Marin glanced at Cole for half a second. Social services, she said. Something in Delia's posture changed, not dramatically, just the slight tightening of someone who has learned that certain titles come with consequences she cannot always predict or control. Cole set down his spoon. Marin's here because she wanted dinner, he said. He looked at Marin. Right, Marin said. Delia didn't entirely believe it, but she didn't leave. Later, while Cole walked Jasper to the truck, Marin and Delia sat at the table alone. No one recorded what they said. When Cole returned, something in Delia's expression had shifted. Not trust. Not quite. But the outer wall of it had moved back a few feet. At the end of the evening, Marin pulled Cole aside while Delia was absorbed in Jasper's mood. The boy in the middle of explaining the color-coding system, which was elaborate, and which he was serious about, and which Delia was listening to with what appeared to be genuine attention. Do you know where she sleeps? Yes, Cole said. You didn't tell me. No, because if you know, you have to follow procedure. And procedure right now would probably mean she doesn't come back next Thursday. Marin looked at him. You're putting me in a difficult position. I know, he said. I'm sorry. Neither of them looked away. Marin finished the draft at 11 that night, sitting at her kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, and a document she had technically started 3 months ago and never gotten past the second page. She was calling it Safe Harbor, a framework that would allow community access points to provide voluntary support to people experiencing homelessness without triggering the mandatory administrative processes that most people experiencing homelessness had learned, correctly, to avoid. The idea wasn't new. What was new was that she finally understood what had been missing from every version she had ever seen proposed before. She sent the draft to Cole at 11:42. She didn't include a note. She wasn't entirely sure she could have explained it. He read it the next morning, sitting in his truck in a gas station parking lot between jobs. He read the whole thing. Then he replied with 3 questions. Short, precise. They went directly to the places where the legal language created gaps that could be exploited or challenged. Marin read them at her desk and stopped moving for a moment. Those were not questions from someone outside the field. They met at a coffee shop 2 days later. The meeting had been scheduled as a 30-minute check-in. It ran for just over 2 hours. Cole pushed back on the state versus federal jurisdictional framing in her compliance section in a way that was precise without being combative. Marin held her ground on the parts she believed in and conceded the parts she couldn't. It was, she thought afterward, the most honest policy conversation she'd had since leaving Charlotte. Somewhere in the second hour she asked him directly, "Can you tell me who you actually are? I looked you up." Cole looked at his coffee cup. He was quiet long enough that it wasn't evasion. It was the pause of someone who has answered this question before and found every available answer incomplete. "I'm a plumber in Asheville," he said. "The rest of it is who I used to be." Those two things aren't contradictory. For me, they are. She heard the door in that, but she also heard the hinge. Before he left, he signed the section marked Initial Agreement in Principle. He picked up the pen, signed his name, and set it down without looking at the paper again. He was out the door before Marin looked at the signature. She sat with it for a while. She wasn't certain whether he had signed because he believed in the proposal, or because he had come to trust her, or because of something that didn't have a name yet in either of those categories. Councilman Terry Falk called Marin in for a closed meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 58 years old and had been on Asheville City Council for 11 of them, long enough to have learned that the most effective way to stop something was rarely to oppose it directly. He expressed concern about Safe Harbor, specifically liability exposure. He said the word liability 4 times in 11 minutes. He was very good at sounding like he was worried about the right things. Then he offered a solution. If Marin was committed to moving forward, she might consider partnering with organizations that had cleaner institutional structures. He had a list. He slid it across the conference table, the way people slide things when they want the gesture to look casual. Marin took the list. She recognized some of the names. Recently incorporated non-profits, all less than 3 years old, none of them with a track record she could point to. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 10 minutes after the meeting. Then she called Cole. She told him what Falk had said. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked for the names on the list. She read them out. He asked her to repeat 2 of them. She heard him writing. He knew those names. Not from Asheville. From federal grant documentation he had reviewed in 2019, a set of organizations that had applied for pilot program funding through a housing initiative he had been building and that he had flagged for conflict of interest before the applications went anywhere. The channel had been blocked at the federal level. Apparently, they had found another route. He looked at the list. Then he looked out the windshield toward Lexington Avenue, 2 blocks east, where the corner where he ate on Thursday evenings was visible from here if the light was right. And somewhere behind the market on the next block, in a lot he had walked past twice, once on purpose and once by accident, a woman named Delia was sleeping in an abandoned truck. He crumpled the piece of paper, smoothed it back out, folded it carefully along a clean crease, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Those 2 things, the list and the woman, had become the same thing in his mind. He didn't know when that had happened. He only knew that it had. Ruth Adler had been running St. Ambrose Community Kitchen on the north side of downtown Asheville for 22 years. She knew where every dollar in her operating budget came from, going back to the years when the kitchen was still in the basement of a church that no longer existed. She also knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched the city change around her multiple times, that money and power in a place like this were not separate things. Cole came to her on a Wednesday morning. He laid the names from Falk's list on the table and watched her face as she read them. She didn't say anything. She stood up, walked into the small office she'd occupied for 2 decades, and came back carrying a padded envelope, the color of old paper. Inside were 3 letters, dated between 2017 and 2019, written on official City of Asheville letterhead and signed by Terry Falk, at the time, Deputy Council Chair. Each letter expressed, in formal and carefully worded language, a concern that St. Ambrose's participation in a federal grant pilot program would create what Falk called an inadvisable precedent of institutional dependence on federal funding streams. The program he had asked them to decline was the direct predecessor of the framework Cole had spent 3 years building at the Treasury Department. Falk had moved against it at the local level, while it was still in draft form, before most people in Washington had heard of it, before it had a formal name, before Cole had ever set foot in Asheville. And Falk had no idea that the man now sitting across from Ruth, reading his own letters, was the person who had written the program he had tried to bury. Cole read all 3 letters. His hands were flat on the table when he finished. "You knew who I was," he said. "It wasn't a question. I figured it out about a year after you started coming around," Ruth said. "I kept waiting for the right moment. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Because you needed time, and because there wasn't a reason big enough yet." He looked at the envelope. "There is now." He scanned every page with his phone, and that evening forwarded the files to an email address he hadn't used in over 3 years. A former colleague at the Federal Government Accountability Office who had been quietly tracking irregular funding patterns in municipal social services contracts across the Southeast. Cole didn't include a message. The documents explained themselves. That afternoon, before Thursday came, he drove to the lot behind the market. He didn't knock on the window of the abandoned truck. He left a bag of food and a worn paperback book on the hood, a text on urban policy that he had read so many times the spine had cracked along the fold line. The inside cover had his name written in it, and below that, a Washington Library return address. He was gone before Delia opened the door. Thursday evening, she set the book on the table between them. She had opened the front cover. She looked at the name. She looked at him. "This is yours," she said. "It's yours now," Cole said. The night Falk scheduled the public budget hearing, Marin received an anonymous email. Inside was a compressed folder containing scanned copies of Ruth Oz, 3 letters, and 3 fiscal year budget documents from the city's Office of Finance, showing a pattern of funds reallocated from social services and housing support into a municipal development partnership. one that, traced carefully across 4 separate LLC filings, led back to a private investment group in which Terry Falk held an undisclosed equity position. Marin didn't call Cole to confirm. She already knew the answer. She spent 2 hours going through every page. By the time she went to bed, she had a legal pad covered in notes and a clear, quiet understanding of what she was going to do in the morning. She had been in this work long enough to know the difference between evidence that could shift a conversation and evidence that could end one. This was the second kind. She sat at the hearing table the next morning with her original report in a folder she never opened. She had brought the documents instead. She asked Falk directly, in front of a room that included 2 local journalists and a reporter from the state capitol who had driven down for unrelated reasons, whether he could explain the sequential reallocation of housing support funds over 3 consecutive fiscal years into a development fund whose primary beneficiary organizations appeared on his own recommended partner list for Safe Harbor. She asked the question in the same voice she used in staff meetings. Steady, clear, slightly too calm to be dismissed as emotional. Falk attempted a response about procedural complexity and multi-year planning cycles. The 2 council members he had prepared did not speak. The room held very still. The budget cut to St. Ambrose and 4 other community service organizations was tabled, pending review. The Safe Harbor proposal was approved in principle for a 90-day pilot. Falk was not arrested. He was not publicly accused of anything. Real accountability rarely arrives in a single moment. It builds quietly in the record. He left the chamber knowing that someone had connected lines he had spent years keeping parallel, and that whoever had done it had given the information to someone who knew exactly what to do with it. Cole watched the live stream from his truck, parked outside a job site he'd finish after lunch. He watched it all the way through. When Marin asked her final question, and the room went quiet for 3 full seconds before Falk began his response, Cole reached over and turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. That afternoon, he didn't text Marin. He texted Delia instead. "Did you watch?" She replied after 4 minutes. "Yeah, she's good." He looked at those 2 words longer than 2 words require. Then he put the truck in drive. 3 weeks after the hearing, Safe Harbor began its pilot phase. Delia was the first person to enroll, not because anyone pressured her, but because Marin had asked once, plainly and honestly, and Delia had taken a short pause and said yes. The program connected her with a transitional housing unit that had a legal address, which meant she could apply to re-enroll at the university as a student, with extenuating circumstances. She submitted the application on a Wednesday afternoon from the computer lab of the public library on Haywood Street. She told Cole about it on Thursday evening, not as news she was reporting, but as something she was still figuring out how to say out loud. She spoke differently, not measuring each word for risk, like someone who had something good to share and was still learning what that felt like. Jasper received the news of her re-enrollment with the solemn consideration it deserved. "Does your school have geography?" he asked. "Yes." "Then you'll find out where my maps are wrong," he said, and nodded once, as though this resolved something that had been troubling him for some time. Delia looked at him. She laughed, not the small, quick, nearly invisible thing from the first night, but a full one, brief and real. Cole saw it and looked at his bowl. After Jasper went inside to talk to Lena about the soup, Cole and Delia stayed at the table. It was the first time they had sat alone without a problem to solve, a decision to make, or a next step to discuss. He asked what she had been studying. Urban sociology, she told him. Concentration in housing policy. She had chosen it before she lost her housing, which she said now with the dry, level tone of someone who had decided the irony was allowed to be funny. He laughed quietly, surprised. She watched him do it. He listened to the rest without offering advice. He didn't tell her what she should do next, or what he might have done differently. He just asked a question when she paused, and another when she was ready, and let the conversation go where she took it. She had not often been listened to in a way that felt like the listener was actually following, rather than waiting for an opening. She realized, somewhere in the middle of it, that she had been talking for 20 minutes without once checking the exits. That was new. She noticed it the way you notice the absence of something that has always been there, not with relief exactly, but with the particular quiet of something no longer being necessary. When she stood up to leave, he stood at the same moment, not to walk her out, just the same movement, happening at the same time. They went to the sidewalk. At the corner where the street split, they both stopped. Neither one stepped off first. "Will you be here next Thursday?" she asked. "Yes," he said. Without hesitation, without adding anything to it. She nodded, turned toward her street. He turned toward his truck. Neither looked back. But they both understood, in the way you understand something that doesn't need to be said, that next Thursday had already become a different kind of thing than all the Thursdays before it. Whatever had been building across all these weeks, across the bowls of soup and the notebook, maps and the late-night phone calls, and the jacket left on a chair, it had a different name now. Neither of them was going to say it out loud. Not yet. But it was there, solid as the corner they had both stopped at, real as the fact that neither one had stepped off first. 14 months after the first Thursday, Cole's backyard held 7 people and a folding table with a cloth that Lena had brought from her own kitchen. The maple tree was turning deep orange. The October light came through at that low angle that makes everything look like it is already a memory being kept. There was Ruth holding a small bunch of dahlias she had cut from her garden that morning. There was Marin standing beside Delia with her hands folded in front of her. There was Jasper in a borrowed suit jacket too wide in the shoulders, standing next to Cole with the posture of someone taking his responsibilities very seriously. And there was Delia, wearing a dress the color of a clear afternoon sky, a color she had always liked best, and which, for the first time in several years, she was in a position to choose for that reason alone. Cole wore his dark flannel shirt, the one Lena had pressed that morning until the fold lines were straight. He had offered to wear something different. Delia had said the flannel was what she knew him in. She wanted to know him in it today. The ceremony was short. When the officiant asked if either of them wanted to say anything, Cole looked at Delia for a long moment. He hadn't prepared anything. He had decided that preparing something would make it feel like a performance, and he had spent enough of his life in rooms where people performed the things they were supposed to feel. He wanted to say something true. "I don't have a lot of promises to make," he said, "but I have this one. I will always push the bowl toward you." No one laughed. No one didn't understand. When it was over, Jasper turned to Delia with the composed expression of a person who has been waiting to say something for exactly the right moment. "Do you want to see the new map? I redrew it. I put our house on it." She crouched beside him. He opened the composition notebook to a new page, dense with his symbols. The ones she had learned by now, the ones she had teased him about when she found out the triangles meant hills rather than mountains. And in the center of the page, marked darker than anything else, was a single point. Beside it, in his 9-year-old handwriting, he had written one word: home. She held the notebook for a while, without giving it back. She traced the symbol at the center with her thumb. Then she handed it back to him. "Don't redraw it," she said. "It's already right." Ruth opened the wine. Marin poured. Lena appeared from the kitchen. No one had formally invited her, but she had been there since 8 that morning cooking, and it would not have occurred to anyone to question it. And Cole stood in the yard and looked at the people around him, Ruth laughing at something Marin had said, Lena handing Jasper a plate and listening to him explain something with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. Delia watching all of it with the unhurried expression of someone who has arrived somewhere and knows it. He had not planned for any of this. He had not worked toward it. He had gone to a noodle shop on a Thursday evening because the day had been long and he didn't want to go home yet. And a young woman had stopped at his table and asked a question that cost her something to ask. One Thursday, one bowl, one question from a woman who wasn't sure it was safe, and a man who didn't hesitate. Neither of them had been looking. That was exactly why they had found each other.